Humility is often mistaken for weakness, especially when it is worn by someone who does not boast of their achievements or demand recognition. The black general carried himself with an ease that disarmed people. He did not enter rooms with the air of someone looking for validation, nor did he remind others of the countless battles he had fought, both literal and symbolic. To those who encountered him, he appeared as an ordinary man, someone who blended into the crowd. This appearance, however, was not by accident. It was intentional, born out of years of discipline and understanding that real strength does not require an audience. He knew that his value did not depend on the approval of others, and so he let the world underestimate him. People around him made assumptions quickly. They judged his skin color, his modest clothes, his calm tone, and thought they had understood his worth. In their minds, he was powerless, perhaps even beneath them. They had no idea that standing before them was someone who had commanded troops, made decisions in the face of danger, and held responsibility heavier than any of them could imagine. They saw a man they thought was small, when in reality, his presence carried the weight of an entire legacy. This blindness to his true stature was not surprising. Many people fail to recognize greatness when it does not arrive in a polished uniform or with a loud proclamation. What made him extraordinary was that he did not need to flaunt who he was. His humility was not forced, not an act. It was genuine. Years of leading men in silence, of making sacrifices without seeking credit, had taught him that humility was not just a virtue, but a shield. It kept him grounded. It gave him clarity when others were blinded by pride. While others raised their voices to demand attention, he chose to remain calm, to watch, to wait. This patience often caused those around him to lower their guard, thinking he had no influence, no strength, no power to shift the balance. The truth was entirely different. Inside him lived a quiet authority, a certainty that came from surviving moments most people could never endure. His life was marked by challenges that would have broken others. Yet he had walked through them with resilience, learning that shouting about victories was not necessary when you could simply embody them. This was the hidden power behind his humility. It was a power that did not require validation, a power that did not crumble when ignored, a power that stood unshaken even when surrounded by doubt and disrespect. Those who underestimated him found comfort in their arrogance. They believed silence meant consent, that calmness meant weakness, and that humility was the same as insignificance. They had no idea that the man they overlooked had stood in rooms with the highest officials, spoken to leaders of nations, and carried the title of general with honor. To him, their arrogance was a noise he had heard many times before. He had faced worse adversaries, harder battles, and greater dangers. Their mockery could not touch the strength he carried inside. What they failed to grasp was that humility is not the absence of power, but its refinement. True power does not need to announce itself at every step. It exists quietly, ready to reveal itself when the right moment demands it. That was the kind of strength the black general possessed. His silence was not emptiness, it was restraint. His calmness was not submission, it was control. His humility was not weakness, it was the mark of someone who knew exactly who he was, even if nobody else in the room did. He allowed them to underestimate him, almost inviting their arrogance to grow unchecked. He stood firm, unshaken by the weight of their judgment. They could not see past the surface, and he did not feel the need to correct them. That was the essence of hidden power behind humility. It thrives without recognition, it waits without fear, and when revealed, it shatters illusions in ways no loud declaration ever could. Arrogance often reveals more about a person than they realize. It exposes their insecurities, their lack of understanding, and their desperate need to feel superior over others. When authority is paired with arrogance, it becomes a dangerous mix, because those in positions of control start to believe they are untouchable. That was exactly what happened in this situation. The people who stood above the black general that day, thinking they held power over him, carried themselves with the smugness of individuals convinced that they were untouchable. They mistook the surface of the moment for its entirety, blind to the truth hidden beneath. They leaned on their uniforms, their roles, and the false belief that authority was permanent. Their laughter and dismissive remarks were not born from strength but from ignorance. They believed the man standing silently before them was someone insignificant, someone who could be mocked without consequence. In their eyes, they were the ones with the control, and he was nothing more than a subject to their whims. What they did not understand was that arrogance blinds the arrogant more than it humiliates the humble. They were digging their own grave, exposing the smallness of their character while the man they ridiculed quietly revealed the greatness of his. Authority, when used with wisdom, earns respect. Authority, when mixed with arrogance, demands submission through fear. They chose the latter. Instead of recognizing the dignity of the man in front of them, they mocked his silence and dismissed his presence. Their arrogance was so deeply rooted that they could not imagine the possibility that he was someone of immense importance. They saw only what they wanted to see, a man they thought had no voice, no power, no right to be treated with respect. The arrogance of authority often grows in environments where people have never been challenged. These men were accustomed to their word being final, to their actions being unquestioned. They carried themselves like kings in a small room, forgetting that true kings never need to prove themselves by crushing others. Each gesture, each smirk, each insult revealed their blindness. They thought they were showing dominance, but all they were really doing was showcasing how fragile their authority truly was. The louder they tried to assert their superiority, the more obvious it became that they feared the possibility of being wrong. What made their arrogance even more striking was the contrast between them and the man they ridiculed. He did not rise to their bait. He did not argue, nor did he try to defend himself. He allowed their arrogance to fill the room like smoke, suffocating them without them even realizing it. His silence became a mirror, reflecting their ugliness back to them. They thought they were in control, but in reality, they were exposing their weakness while he maintained his strength. This dynamic is the very essence of arrogance. It creates illusions of power that collapse the moment true strength reveals itself. Their laughter was not a sign of confidence, it was a mask. Behind it was the insecurity of men who relied entirely on the badges, titles, or seats they occupied. Strip them of those, and what would remain? Nothing more than ordinary men, insecure and small. Yet they had become so used to equating authority with superiority that they could not see past the illusion. They assumed that belittling another person would reinforce their position, not realizing that their arrogance was eroding the very respect they thought they commanded. The arrogance of authority is most dangerous when it underestimates the quiet ones. The general's silence was not ignorance. It was patience. He knew who he was, what he represented, and what he could do if the moment called for it. He allowed them to reveal themselves through their arrogance, allowed them to dig deeper into their own false sense of security. Every insult, every dismissive look, every mocking tone was a step closer to the moment when they would finally realize who they had underestimated. Arrogance is often loud, desperate to fill the space with its presence. True strength, on the other hand, does not need to shout. That was the balance in that room, arrogance shouting to prove its existence, and silent strength watching, waiting, holding back its revelation. The more they displayed their arrogance, the more obvious the difference between them and him became. Their authority was borrowed and fragile, while his was earned and unshakable. They did not realize it then, but their arrogance was not humiliate. A single phone call can sometimes carry more weight than 1,000 words spoken in defense. In moments where arrogance fills the air and respect is denied, it is not always strength of voice or heated arguments that shift the balance, but the quiet decision to reveal power at the right time. That is exactly what the black general understood. He stood in silence, allowing those around him to dismiss him, to underestimate him, to push his patience to its limit. He did not reveal his identity, did not rush to prove who he was, because true authority does not panic when it is ignored. He knew there would come a moment when their arrogance would collapse under the weight of undeniable truth. That moment came with the simple act of pulling out a phone and making a call. For those who had been mocking him, it seemed like nothing. To them, a phone call was meaningless. They did not grasp that in his hands, that phone was not just a device but a key to unlocking a world they had no access to. They assumed he was calling for sympathy or pleading for help, but they did not realize he was summoning a level of influence that reached far above their authority. The weight of that phone call was not in the action itself but in the network, the legacy, and the respect that stood behind it. When a man of true stature makes a call, he is not seeking permission, he is commanding attention from those who already know his worth. The power of that moment lay in its simplicity. No shouting, no confrontation, no desperate attempt to prove himself, just a calm, deliberate movement, as though he had been waiting for this precise moment to act. The room, still filled with mocking voices, did not yet understand what was unfolding. They had no idea that the silence after the call would be more deafening than all their laughter combined. They could not imagine how quickly their certainty would evaporate when the voice on the other end of that line responded with respect and urgency. What made this phone call so powerful was not just who he was calling, but what it symbolized. It was a reminder that real power does not need to be seen to exist. It can remain hidden, waiting, until the exact moment it is needed. Those who doubted him believed he was powerless because they measured worth by what they could see in front of them. They had no imagination for the unseen forces that can shift everything in an instant. That call was proof that authority does not always reside in uniforms, badges, or loud declarations. Sometimes, it lives quietly in the relationships, the recognition, and the respect earned over a lifetime. The arrogance of those who mocked him had convinced them that they controlled the room. They thought their voices were final, that their judgment could not be overturned. But the sound of his calm voice speaking into the phone was the first crack in their illusion. With each passing second, the balance of power began to shift. They could not hear the words on the other end, but they could sense the difference in his composure. He was not pleading. He was not asking. He was simply informing, as a man does when he knows he will be answered without hesitation. The silence that followed the call began to change the atmosphere. The men who had mocked him noticed it too late. What had seemed like a trivial action at first began to carry an unfamiliar weight. There is a certain stillness that comes when people realize they may have crossed a line they cannot step back from, and that stillness began to fill the room. They could feel it, though they could not name it. The laughter that had once been loud now felt hollow, and every eye that had once looked down on him began to glance uneasily in his direction. The phone call was more than a conversation. It was a signal. It was the moment when hidden power was unveiled not by declaration but by action. It demonstrated that strength does not always show itself at the beginning of a conflict. Sometimes, it waits until arrogance has grown so blind, so certain of its superiority, that the revelation of truth hits with the force of a storm. For the general, this was not about proving himself but about reminding them of the reality they had refused to see. The call was not just to a person, it was to an entire world of respect, authority, and influence that stood behind him, ready to respond in his defense without question. Him, it was preparing the stage for their own humiliation. Silence has a weight that few people understand until they are forced to feel it. When arrogance fills a room, when laughter and mockery echo against the walls, there is nothing more powerful than the sudden hush that follows a revelation. That silence is not empty. It carries shame, fear, respect, and realization all at once. In the moment after the black general's phone call, the same men who had been so loud, so confident in their mockery, were struck by the kind of silence that cannot be explained away. It was the silence that comes when truth sweeps the floor clean of every illusion, leaving only the reality that had been ignored. What makes such silence so profound is that it is unplanned. No one prepares for it. Those who had been laughing just moments earlier found their voices stolen, as if the very air in their lungs had been snatched away. The room that once felt small and comfortable to them suddenly grew heavy, pressing down on their shoulders. They realized in an instant that the man they had dismissed was not just another face, not just someone to belittle. He carried a presence they had been too blind to see, and now that blindness was gone. The silence was their first taste of what real respect feels like, not demanded, not shouted, but forced upon them by truth itself. It is often said that respect cannot be taught to the arrogant through words, but only through moments that strip them of their false security. This was one of those moments. Their badges, their authority, their superiority meant nothing against the power that had just been revealed. The general had not raised his voice, had not argued, had not stooped to their level. Instead, he allowed the call to speak for him. And when the weight of that call settled over the room, silence replaced their arrogance. That silence was the sound of respect, even if they could not bring themselves to admit it yet. There is a unique kind of fear hidden inside respect when it is forced upon someone who had previously shown none. These men began to feel it slowly, the unease of knowing they had misjudged the situation entirely. They could not take back the words they had spoken, nor could they undo the way they had looked down on him. All they could do now was sit in the silence of their own shame. The room that had once felt like theirs no longer belonged to them. The balance of power had shifted completely, and they were left scrambling internally to reconcile their arrogance with the reality of the man before them. The silence was also a teacher. It reminded them that appearances deceive, that true strength does not always come dressed in the ways they expect. They had thought their laughter gave them dominance, but now they understood that silence itself can be a weapon far sharper than mockery. It cut through their pride, stripped them bare of the illusion that they were in control, and left them standing exposed. The general had not needed to tell them who he was, the silence told them everything. In that quietness, they could almost hear the echo of their own arrogance collapsing. For the general, this silence was not a victory he celebrated, but simply a confirmation of what he had always known. He understood that people reveal themselves in how they treat those they believe to be powerless. Their silence was proof of their mistake. It was the natural consequence of underestimating him, of misjudging humility for weakness. He had not sought their respect, but when the truth was revealed, respect came uninvited. It filled the room, heavy and undeniable, and no one dared to interrupt it. In that stillness, time itself seemed to slow. Every second of silence felt stretched, magnified, pressing down on those who had been arrogant just moments before. It was not a silence that could be broken by forced words or nervous laughter. It was the kind that holds people captive, demanding reflection whether they want it or not. The silence that follows true respect is not gentle. It is sharp, it is suffocating, and it reminds everyone present that power does not need to shout. It simply exists, and when it is revealed, there is nothing left to say. People often make the mistake of judging others by appearances, using shallow observations as the basis for their conclusions. They look at the clothes someone wears, the tone of their voice, the color of their skin, the way they carry themselves, and they believe they can determine worth, authority, or importance. That is exactly what happened to the black general. To the ones who stood before him, his quiet demeanor and modest presence suggested weakness. They thought his silence was submission, his patience was powerlessness, and his humility was insignificance. What they did not realize was that appearances can be the most deceptive masks of all, and those who rely on them often find themselves humiliated when reality tears through their illusions. The arrogance of those men came from the belief that they could read him with a glance. They saw no uniform, no rank on display, no indication of status that demanded their respect. To them, he was just another man, someone ordinary, someone beneath their notice. They believed their eyes told them the truth, but in reality, their vision was clouded by prejudice and arrogance. They judged too quickly, too harshly, without considering that greatness does not always announce itself loudly. True power does not always arrive in grand uniforms or with medals pinned to the chest. Sometimes it walks in quietly, dressed in simplicity, waiting for the moment it must reveal itself. Their mistake was not just in underestimating him but in believing their assumptions were facts. They thought they had defined him, boxed him into a corner based solely on what they could see. But appearances can only tell part of a story, and often, the part they tell is the most misleading. A man may look fragile and yet hold unimaginable strength. Another may appear poor and yet command vast influence. A quiet face may conceal a history of sacrifice and victories. In the general's case, what they thought was weakness was simply restraint. What they believed was insignificance was actually discipline. The lesson hidden in this moment is one that repeats itself throughout history: those who are judged by appearances are often the ones who hold the deepest truths within them. The general's presence was a test, and those who failed it revealed more about themselves than about him. By dismissing him so easily, they exposed their own blindness. They showed they could not look beyond the surface, that they valued people only when symbols of power were displayed openly. It is a dangerous way to live, because sooner or later, reality arrives to shatter such shallow judgments. For the general, this was nothing new. He had walked through countless rooms where people doubted him at first sight. He had endured the weight of assumptions his entire life, learning to live with the knowledge that people would underestimate him before they ever knew him. But rather than let those judgments break him, he used them as fuel. He knew that appearances could be turned into a shield, allowing him to move unnoticed until the right moment. He understood that being underestimated was not always a curse, sometimes it was the greatest advantage. Those who looked down on him never saw the power he carried until it was too late. The ones who mocked him had no idea how much responsibility he had shouldered, how many lives had depended on his leadership, how many decisions he had made in moments where hesitation meant death. None of that was visible in his simple clothes or calm expression. They saw only what they wanted to see, and in doing so, they set themselves up for the shock of their lives. Their failure to look deeper meant they were unprepared for the truth. When it finally revealed itself, it struck with a force they could not defend against, because they had built their confidence on nothing but false appearances. The power of this lesson is timeless. Appearances are unreliable, and those who lean on them will always fall. The general did not need to dress his identity in grandeur to prove his worth. His life, his legacy, and his influence spoke for him when the moment demanded it. Those who misjudged him learned too late that respect should not be reserved for the obvious. True respect means seeing beyond the surface, recognizing that greatness often hides in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to unfold. How one man's identity changed the game was not just about the revelation of his title or the respect that followed. It was about the shift in power, the collapse of arrogance, and the undeniable truth that who he really was could not be ignored. Until that moment, those who surrounded the black general believed they controlled the situation. They thought they had stripped him of dignity with their words and laughter. But the instant his true identity surfaced, everything they thought they knew was destroyed. The balance of the room flipped, and suddenly the very man they had dismissed became the center of gravity. His identity carried a weight they had not anticipated, a force that demanded silence, recognition, and respect. Identity is more than a name or a rank. It is the history a person carries, the battles they have fought, the sacrifices they have made, and the authority they have earned. For the general, his identity was not merely a military title. It was the story of a life lived in service, the embodiment of discipline, sacrifice, and leadership that had shaped him. Those who had underestimated him were blind to all of this until the truth could no longer be hidden. Once it was revealed, they had no choice but to see him for who he really was. Their arrogance evaporated because identity, once known, has the power to rewrite the entire narrative of a moment. The change in the room was immediate. What had been laughter turned into silence, and what had been mockery turned into unease. The same men who had dismissed him now found themselves searching for words they could not find. His identity stripped them of their false superiority, exposing the weakness in their arrogance. They had relied on appearances, on assumptions, and on shallow judgments, but identity cut through all of that. It reminded them that true worth does not need to be performed or proven, it simply exists, and when revealed, it commands recognition whether one is willing or not. The general himself did not need to raise his voice or demand apologies. His very existence, once acknowledged for what it was, changed the dynamics of the room. That is the power of identity. It does not argue, it declares. It does not plead, it commands. In that moment, the game was no longer theirs to control. The rules had shifted, and every person present was forced to reckon with the truth they had ignored. The man they thought was powerless was, in reality, the most powerful presence in the room. What made this transformation so striking was how quickly it happened. Moments earlier, they had felt untouchable, certain in their superiority. Now, they sat in the shadow of a man whose identity dwarfed their own authority. The very same man they had overlooked had connections, influence, and recognition that reached far beyond their limited reach. It was no longer a question of whether they respected him, it was a question of how much their own arrogance had already cost them. Identity, when misunderstood, can lead people to make grave mistakes. But identity, when revealed, has the power to crush those mistakes in an instant. That was the lesson unfolding in front of them. Their arrogance had blinded them, but the truth of who he was forced their eyes open. They had believed they were strong because they held authority in that room, but now they realized they were standing before someone who held authority over far greater domains. They had treated him as though he were small, and now they were the ones made small in comparison. For the general, revealing his identity was not about revenge or satisfaction. It was about necessity. He had given them every chance to see him for who he was through his character, his composure, and his silence. They had refused. They had chosen arrogance over respect, assumptions over truth. And so the time came when his identity spoke louder than anything else could. That was when the game changed, when the balance of power was no longer in their hands but firmly in his.